Liz, thanks for coming in today to talk about your own professional pathway and journey to arrive here at UC Irvine, as well as your work. So let's start with the former. What drew you to join UCI's School of Education?
Oh, well, that's kind of interesting. I'm a speech language pathologist, and my work focuses on kids who are bilingual. And our training and our research, I think, is really related to the kind of work that's done here at UCI in the School of Education. So for me, being in a School of Education is really nice because I have the opportunity to collaborate with people who are doing related parallel work and work that really impacts some of my work can impact theirs, and some of their work can impact mine. Children with developmental language disorder often have educational difficulties as well, and lots of times we think of developmental language disorder in isolation to everything else, but there's a lot of overlap with reading disabilities or math disabilities, general learning disabilities, and I think it's important to kind of situate that work in this broader context.
And you gave up a lot to come here. You were an endowed chair at UT Austin. And we're, as you know, Liz, we're a startup here, the UCI School of Education, only a school for 5 years, and you were willing to give up that endowed chair to join this community. So can you speak a little bit about that decision making?
For me, it was kind of an exciting move. I see UCI's School of Ed kind of rising, and it's kind of exciting and fun to be in an environment where things are being created. And where you can kind of shape that path. I also saw an incredible commitment to working with students of color, to working with populations from broad diversity, socioeconomically, racial, ethnic diversity, which is really core to the work that I do. And so for me, that was really important work. And a lot of those things are what drew me to UCI. I felt like I was at the University of Texas for 23 years, and I had done about, I thought, what I could do in a smaller environment. Not smaller, but smaller, a small department in a big place. And so I think this is a really good step for me in terms of, just furthering some of this work.
And going back a step further, what initially drew you to educational research generally, or speech language issues in particular? Was there something in your background or that kind of pushed you in that area?
Well, I grew up as a heritage language speaker, so I learned English in kindergarten. My mom always said that she and I learned English at the same time, and I spoke Spanish at home growing up, and I was always really interested in how do bilingual kids kind of organize and access their two languages, and how is that organized in the brain. I went to school to become a speech pathologist, and I kind of stayed on that path. And I worked in the field for about 5 years before I decided to go back for the PhD. And while I was a speech pathologist, it was the 1980s, and we knew that we had to do less biased assessment. We knew that we had to consider the first language in assessment, but we didn't really know how to do that. And a lot of those gaps are things that I saw in my own clinical work, and that's kind of what the impetus was for going back to school and trying to fill those gaps. And that's really been the focus of my work ever since. There's been, I'm finally now getting to the point where I can start to think about how the semantic system is organized for bilingual kids, because we needed instrumentation, we needed methods, we needed better measures in order to quantify what bilingual kids were doing in each of their languages. So
Unpack that a little bit for me.
Okay.
The semantic system.
The semantic system is vocabulary, but it's beyond vocabulary. It's looking at how words are related to each other, and it concerns vocabulary depth. So how can you tell me all the animals that you can think of? Tell me all the fruits that you can think of. Kids with language impairment have pretty good vocabulary, but they have problems organizing that vocabulary. They have problems making those connections among words. And that's where you see some breakdowns, and that's going to affect their language learning, and it's going to affect their access to curriculum in an educational setting. For bilingual kids, they don't necessarily know English well, or for emerging bilinguals. And so how do we know whether there's a language difference or whether there's really a developmental language disorder? And so I'm trying to tease apart what a real difficulty is versus, well, this is just second language learning. These are the kinds of educational programs that would benefit them, but they don't need speech and language therapy, or they don't need a resource specialist.
Yeah, so why is it so important today to get that question right? The distinction between bilingual backgrounds and language disability.
Well, developmental language disorder is one of the most common disability categories in public education. It affects about 10%, 7 to 10% of the population as a primary difficulty. And it's something that people have rarely heard of. Sometimes these kids are seen as slow or lazy, but they may have underlying difficulties that impede their ability to learn language. And language is really the foundation by which you interact with other people, you learn to read and write, you learn to, you get your education through the vehicle of language. So it's really critical. Bilingual kids, or kids who are emerging bilinguals who are learning English as a second language, are often either over or under identified as having developmental language disorders. In early stages, sometimes these kids are under identified because people think, well, let's give them another year to learn the language, and then we'll do the assessment. But they might lose a year of intervention that they could have gotten that might help them close that gap. And so we need to get it right in the early stages so that we can provide them with the interventions that they need and the support that they need early on. The sooner you start that intervention, the more easily they'll be able to catch up to their peers.
And this population we're talking about, bilingual students and also students with language disabilities, this is not a small group anymore.
It's not a small group anymore. Right. That's right. So in the US, 1 of every 5 kids that walks in a classroom door is going to speak another language. In California, it's 2 out of 5. So it's a significant part of the population, and we need to do better by them. If we're going to educate a broad citizenry in our public schools, we need to do it well for 100% of the population. And so I think that's why it's really critical that we get this right and that we provide them with the educational and health services that they need in a timely way.
And can you speak a little bit about differences that your work might be heading in now that you moved to Orange County from Texas?
Well, one really exciting thing in California is that we have bilingual education again. For 20 years, it was, not allowed. And, well, it was, but it wasn't. And so I think that that's an exciting time. I think that there's a broader awareness in California that bilingualism is good for you, and it could be good for a lot of kids. And so for me, that's also kind of exciting to come back to California at a time where we're trying to figure out how should we educate educators, how should we educate kids, what language do we need to do these things in, what helps maximize transfer between one language and another, and coming in at a time where there's like a broader support for bilingual education and bilingualism, for me is really fun.
And in our community here, for example, we have dual language schools.
Exactly.
Say a little bit about the excitement of working with some of those schools.
Yeah, so in dual language schools, kids are going to be hearing and using in different models 2 languages. So you might see Spanish English dual language schools, or I think Vietnamese English, Mandarin English, Korean English are the kind of dual language schools I've heard of in the area. And so we have a lot of different languages in the Orange County area, and kids are learning English as their second language, but they're coming to it from different languages that have different rules and different vocabulary and different sounds. So for me, from a speech pathology perspective, it's really fun to see and to start to explore what does English look like in a kid who uses Spanish as the first language, where there's lots of grammar, versus a kid who's coming from a Mandarin speaking background where grammatical markers are almost non-existent and grammar is marked very differently, and they're learning English. So is the English from a Mandarin speaker going to be different from English of a Spanish speaker? And then how do we tease apart what's normal development, second language development, and what is potential problematic second language acquisition?
Right. And much of your work has been on that issue of assessment, of accurately diagnosing these differences.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that and the challenges of developing new instruments that would be appropriate for Vietnamese or Mandarin speaking students?
Yeah, we developed with an NIH grant or NIH contract a Spanish-English bilingual test, and we focused on bilingual Spanish-English speakers, or the contract, the RFP, the request for proposals focused on Spanish-English bilinguals, because Spanish is the most common language spoken after English. And so there's a huge population of Spanish speakers. About 80% of bilingual kids are Spanish-English bilinguals. So it's a good population to start with. We had lots of kids who could participate in our studies, and we started looking at what are indicators of language impairment in Spanish and what are indicators of language impairment in English for this group of kids. My hope is that we can extend some of what we've learned to some of these smaller populations that are still significant in the country. So Vietnamese and Chinese are the next 2 largest language groups, and there's virtually no instruments for them either. We're hoping that we can take what we learned and kind of accelerate the process. So it took us about 20 years to come up with some of the measures, and we came up with about 3 different measures for bilingual Spanish-speaking kids. But we're hoping that we can take what we've learned to, extend this to other languages based on what we learned from those languages or from Spanish. The other thing that we need to do is start to think about intervention. So that's kind of a next step in the work that I'm doing. So that makes it, being in the School of Ed is another tie to that, because I think a lot of what we're doing in the School of Ed is looking at curriculum and interventions and best practices that way. So how can we integrate speech and language services into everyday schoolwork? And so what I'm trying to do right now with some colleagues is to identify what the milestones of second language learning would be for kids with language impairment. and what the milestones would be for Spanish language development so that we can provide more integrated services for them that affect not just their oral language, but their reading and writing and math skills and social studies skills and so on.
Before we get to the intervention, so that getting that assessment right, I know, is so near and dear to you. I've never seen you as passionate as when you talk about the importance of precision in these instruments.
Well, there's a paper out, it's about 10 years old, that for English, that reviewed the 43, at the time, most commonly used measures of developmental language disorder in monolingual English populations. Of those 43, something like 5 or 6 met high criteria for precision. So they were sensitive and specific. So they identified language impairment accurately and identified not having language impairment accurately, because you can be really accurate if you over-identify, or if you or you can rule out language if you under-identify. But you need to have both of those, sensitivity and specificity. It's not that different for Spanish-English bilingualism. In fact, it's even more challenging because some of the errors that kids make look like language impairment. And so how do you know if it's a true error that indicates impairment or if it's an error of second language acquisition? And so we've been trying to tease that apart as well, and we've gotten pretty close. The measures that we've developed are about 90% or better accuracy. So we're very happy with that. But when I speak to clinicians, they're sometimes surprised to find that the tests that they hold near and dear aren't that accurate. They're not that accurate for monolingual English speakers. They're not that accurate for Spanish speakers either.
So other than precision and measurement and interventions that are going to make a difference in young people's lives, the other thing I've often heard you speak passionately about is PhD training. I know you did a lot of that at UT Austin in terms of, you were the director of the program.
I was the chair of the graduate studies. Yeah.
Exactly. So share with me a little bit about your philosophy about what's important in doctoral training.
I see doctoral training as kind of a cultural immersion, actually. So for me, you're learning the rules and the language of being an academic. In my area, there's a critical shortage of PhDs. About a third of positions in academia go unfilled every year. And so I've made it a priority to educate doctoral students who will go into those academic jobs. And I think that what you need to do is you need to work with students to teach them about conducting research, writing research, getting papers out, teaching, doing all the things that an academic does. And I think you do it through having them hang around all the time, because I do see it. Sometimes students will contact me and say, well, can I do a PhD program part-time? I don't think so. I think it's a full-time immersion experience. You don't get that hallway learning if you're not around, if you go and take a class. Especially at the PhD level, we already know that you're good at taking classes. It's all the other stuff that you need to learn to do and to coordinate. So how do you ask good research questions? At what point do you start writing it up for publication? From the very beginning. How do you get through that process of submitting a paper and revising a paper and responding to feedback? Those are all the things that I think that we don't necessarily formalize, that are probably the critical pieces of learning how to become an academic.
Can you speak a little bit about your research over the next 5 years, where it's heading?
I'm interested probably in two things, well, maybe three. So one, I want to expand some of the measurement work I've done with Spanish-English bilinguals to think about how we might test kids who speak other languages. I think an important thing that we can do, we have enough data to start to develop some theories to test out systematically, is we might be able to do more than we thought in English. We might need to do different kinds of things, so it's not just about renorming a test, but rather thinking about what markers would be good indicators of impairment for a child at different levels of English language acquisition. The reality is 96% of speech pathologists speak English as their only language. So that doesn't match up with 20% of the population or 20% of their caseload knowing another language. So they need some tools that they can use in English that's going to help them. So that's one area. The other area, I think I want to focus more and more on intervention. So now that we have these kids identified, what do we do? And how can we maximize transfer between two languages? And how can we integrate our services? Something I'm always concerned about is kids who have speech and language problems often have reading difficulties or math difficulties, and every specialist comes in and pulls them out. How can we deliver services that are going to be more efficient and integrated across these different domains? And I think that's a great reason to be in a school of ed, because there's people who think about, their different areas as well. But I think we need to think about services that are more efficient. And the other thing that I've been thinking about and have started to do some exploring in is how do we get people to uptake best practices? In the bilingual area, there aren't very many people who speak other languages, but there's people with a lot of knowledge, but they don't necessarily know how to implement that knowledge. And so how do you bring them along to use those best practices in the settings that they're in? We know from like the translation science area that it takes 17 years on average to move, a small part of what we learn clinically into, clinical practices. And that, almost 20-year gap is a frustration for me. So the kinds of things that I came across when I was a clinician 30 years ago, people still ask me about. I'm like, we know better now. We should be doing better. And so, I think probably in the next 5 to 10 years, that's another area I'd like to go in, because we need to implement what we're doing or what we know at a larger scale.
Right, and as the School of Education does more in Orange County, and we launch all these partnerships, I think there's an opportunity to accelerate this kind of work.
Exactly, yeah.
I would say a little bit more about kind of the impact of accelerating that work here in Orange County, and the extent to which Orange County might be a setting that's particularly conducive and open to these kind of this kind
Orange
of work.
County is a great area to do this. First, the population of bilinguals is huge. It's more like 40% compared to 20%, which is what you see nationwide. And so I think it's more critical that we're doing the right thing. I think there's probably a larger concentration of people, teachers, speech pathologists, resource specialists, reading specialists who speak other languages. And so that's a great opportunity as well. So you've got people who have some knowledge, maybe they don't know how to implement these bilingual approaches, but they definitely have the dedication and the energy and the awareness that they need to do something a little bit different. So I think we can partner with them to kind of help make that happen. Even everyday things like I hear very often, oh, well, if a child has a developmental language disorder, speaking two languages is going to confuse them. And that's not true. Over and over and over, we see research that shows that bilingualism actually is not a problem. And bilingualism isn't a cure, or monolingualism isn't a cure for developmental language disorder. And in fact, it could actually help kids who are having difficulties develop awareness of language and linguistic features that they need to include as they use speech, as they read and write. And so I think we can use that to advantages, and we've got to just stop letting people say only use one language. But probably once a week I get a question about that. Should we only speak one language? My pediatrician said we should just switch to one language because the child has Down syndrome. The school principal said blah, blah, blah. So I think we need to increase awareness that bilingualism is a good thing, and it has some natural consequences that could support learning outcomes.
Right. It seems particularly in the 21st century when our own society is so diverse, but also when it's globally connected.
Yeah.
This really, speaking more than one language, developing more than one language, really has to be seen as an opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. And then if you look at some of the job outlooks, the need for bilingual people is only going to increase, especially as we compete on this global market. And so it's almost it's completely counterintuitive that we would say, oh no, we should only speak one language because we'll put all our effort into that.
For Orange County, economic development really is connected to getting this question right. And,
Exactly.
and your work really is at the center of it. Liz, thanks so much for coming in today and sharing your work and a little bit of your larger perspective with us.
Thank you. It was fun.